Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about addressing some of the big issues which are undermining democracies around the world. In our third series, we've been focusing on the crisis and the opportunity of citizenship in the 2020s. And we've done a lot of shows on deliberative democracy. My guest today on the show is one of the world's leading innovators and thinkers when it comes to both reinventing citizenship in contemporary democracy and particularly focusing on deliberative democracy. Her name is Claudia Chwalisz. I hope I pronounced that name, Claudia, right. I know it has a soft C. You're originally, your family's from Poland, but you grew up in Canada, and you are currently involved very much on innovating deliberative democracy within the OECD. Claudia, before we begin to talk about deliberative democracy and the crisis of citizenship in the 2020s, how would you define democracy itself?
Well, I mean, I tend to go to the very basic definition of democracy as a form of collective self-government. So how we take collective public decisions together as a people living together in a shared society.
Is there a crisis, do you think, in the 2020s when it comes to citizenship? Is the problem that we are not giving citizens enough power? Or is the problem the nature of government and the fact that the voter, we might call them the citizen, have lost trust, lost faith in politics and democracy itself?
I think that question kind of goes in both directions, because we talk so often about citizens having lost trust in government, in democracy, in politics, in the system. But I think that we also have a crisis of trust of people in government in their citizens. And we're at a point in time where we talk so much about the crisis of democracy also being linked to, problems around either globalization or technological change, social media, and so on. But I think that is true, but at the same time, the question and the causality goes in the other direction. Like, are those things problematic? Because the people who are within our governing positions in our political systems have let them be problems. Because I really do think that we're seeing a crisis of our democratic institutions really failing to tackle some of these biggest issues of our day. And those are due to features that are design features, not flaws in the system. So we see that elections, with their inherent short-termism, every 4 or 5 years, depending on what country you're in, that's the only way to be making decisions, but also that's the dynamic driving the incentives for people who are in positions of power, has led to inaction on a lot of long-term questions, which go beyond that short-term thinking, which also go beyond the internal logic of political parties and some of the other design incentives of electoral democracy.
But aren't citizens only ever thinking in the short term? What's wrong with short-term thinking? Everything's short-term, whether it's corporations or our lives, as Keynes famously said, in the long term we're all dead. What's wrong with short-term politics?
Well, I like the provocation because it allows me to come back and challenge it a bit, because I think clearly issues that we're facing around the climate, for instance, these are long-term issues that will not affect just us today, but also future generations. They require difficult decisions and actions from us today, both on the individual level, but also on the policy level, in terms of regulations and other things that need to be done, but which are hard to do. And they're not happening. So we have a huge inaction problem, which is also down to the way the political system is designed and the incentives within it.
Claudia, you've written a lot about populism, the causes, the effects of populism in the age of Trump and Bolsonaro and Duterte and Erdogan and Orban and Vladimir Putin. How does the rise of populism and this crisis of citizenship and of democracy, how are they connected?
I like that you asked that question, because for me, actually, all the work I've been doing on democracy has stemmed from my research and interest in populism, which I was doing well before I joined the OECD as well. So, and actually well before Trump and Brexit and Bolsonaro and everything. So looking actually around 2010.
Sorry to interrupt, Claudia. People always throw
Yeah.
Brexit in. Brexit isn't Bolsonaro. Brexit isn't Trump. I mean, it was the will of the English to leave.
Of course. I mean, I'm talking about it in the sense that I think the way populism has been discussed in the popular media changed after those moments in time. So I'm not actually necessarily lumping them together, but having lived in the UK at the time of Brexit and the vote, I can tell you that there was a lot of talk about populism in the media and elsewhere. And all that to go back to actually answering the question, in the sense that my interest in populism was trying to understand the extent to which people were turning towards populist parties and leaders as a form of expressing their discontent with politics, with politicians, with the system, with government. Because at the time, a lot of the focus was just on the economic and the cultural factors, which are a part of it. I'm not saying that they're not, but this third element of the political discontent, from my own work and also looking into the research of others, I found really to be one of the underlying drivers of populism. And so if that's the case, then it's not going to be just with different economic policies or policies on immigration or anything else alone that will actually quell people's sense of discontent, their feelings of not having a voice in the system, of their voice not counting at all, which then led me into this world of democratic innovation and thinking, okay, how could we actually change democracy, democratic processes and institutions in a way that would give people a genuinely meaningful voice in shaping the policies that are affecting their day-to-day lives. And amongst all of the broader innovations that I've looked at, I personally found deliberative democracy to be most compelling at actually touching at some of those underlying drivers, because I really do think that the reasons why people are voting for populists are actually rooted in a lot of legitimate disillusionment, and we shouldn't ignore that.
It's interesting. That was exactly the question I was actually going to come to next. This, I guess, the legitimacy of populism. The word itself, it seems to me in our shows, it's often used by progressives as a critique of ordinary people. Do you use the word in a pejorative sense? It sounds to me as if you think it can be legitimate in some ways to react against the system, against democracy, against traditional political parties.
Well, I think there's two things here. I think there's one to look at what is driving people towards these parties and outlets, and it's a lot more complex than I think what is often discussed. And I really think that that sense of disillusionment is very much legitimate, and people are right to feel like their voice doesn't count, because quite frankly, honestly, most of the time it doesn't. And there's a difference then with the types of policies or proposals that populists are putting forth as solutions to the problem. So here I have a very different view on what kind of future I would like for democracy. And I've always found it quite problematic that populists claim to be speaking in the name of the general will of the people, as though that can be something, that actually exists in a way that isn't pluralistic. So those are two different things. But I think, my first book was called The Populist Signal. I've always seen this as a signal of something else. And we need to look deeper at the underlying drivers of it and address those rather than the populist symptoms in a way.
Yeah, and I think your second book was the People's Verdict. So you're definitely focusing on this. Let's go back to Brexit and referendums. Aren't referendums a good way to articulate the will of the people? What's wrong with politics by referendum?
My view on referendums is that they are a very different form of democracy, first of all, to deliberative democracy or participatory democracy. It's a form of direct democracy, as though people who are voting in the referendums are able to then directly influence a policy choice or decision or whatnot. But what we see often happens in a referendum setting is that a very complex policy issue gets boiled down to a more simplified version of the issue at hand, and then also gets reduced down to a binary set of options. And so you have people voting in a usually rather uninformed way about a complex issue, but they're not even able to, like the conditions have not been created for people to grapple with that complexity. And so we have situations like, for instance, I mean, like we were talking about Brexit earlier, where people were voting in a context where it's a very complicated question about whether or not the UK should leave the EU, but and it wasn't even clear what leaving meant, because that was then subject to a negotiation. And so perhaps here in that situation, the issue was that there wasn't then a second referendum about, okay, now that we know what leaving means, what do people think at this point in time? But we have also lots of examples from other countries that use referendums and ballot measures on a regular basis that, you know, most people are not able to get fully informed about the issues, and then they get framed in a very polarizing way, whereas in reality, these are not yes or no questions.
Brexit is a yes or no issue, and it's an emotional one. You're right, of course, that it's incredibly complex. It's as complex as you want to make it. You're presenting it as a technocratic problem of policies and economics, which, of course, on one level, to many people it is. But to others, particularly who are opposed to it, it's simply, we don't want to be part of Europe. We don't want to be part of the European community. We don't like the idea. We prefer the sovereignty of the UK. And that's what it boils down to. I mean, that's a legitimate way of thinking about politics, isn't it?
I mean, yes, it is definitely a legitimate way of thinking about politics, but I don't think it's the right way to try and get to a sense of what should we do on this issue. Because, you know, yes, of course, there is that broader, more emotive element about, you know, whether we want to be part of this union and what that means to our identity and other things. But then at the end of the day, that decision has huge ramifications for people's day-to-day lives. And so without taking into account what are the different ways will this actually impact me, it's hard to get people to get to a point where they might also be willing to find a middle ground or compromise. And like I was saying, there's a whole negotiation that then happened about what Brexit actually means, which was not clear when people were voting. Like if you contrast that, for example, with the Irish referendum that took place about changing the constitution on abortion, this was preceded by a citizens' assembly where there were 100 citizens who deliberated for 5 months, who gave their recommendations for how the legislation should change if people vote for the change, which then went to the special parliamentary committee and then went on to the government, so that when people went to the ballot box on that referendum issue, they actually knew what they were voting for in terms of, okay, if we vote to change the constitution, this is what that change looks like. So I suppose the more nuanced answer to your first question is that I think that you can have referendums and they can be useful when it comes to such a big, broader societal change that's happening. But I think that we see that when you combine it actually with a more deliberative form of engagement, it helps overcome some of that polarization that can come with a referendum context, and also allows that more nuanced deliberation to happen about, you know, what does change actually mean and what do we want it to mean?
I'm curious, Claudia, it seems as if both progressives and conservatives, or right and left, both agree that there's a crisis of citizenship, crisis of democracy. And it's curious that on the right, the solution seems to be referendum, direct democracy of one kind or another. And progressives seem to be embracing the deliberative democracy model, which we've had lots of shows about, which you're an expert on. Why do you think progressive and conservative critics of democracy are divided on the solution?
I think I disagree with you, though, about this depiction of being a progressive versus a more, I don't know how you think it, more right-wing proposal to the as a solution to this problem, because we've also seen that there have been quite a lot of politicians also on the centre-right who have initiated citizens' assemblies. And in the examples where we have now about some of these processes becoming institutionalized, so becoming like part of the ongoing infrastructure of how our democracies work, there's been a lot of effort put in by the people who have been initiating this to also get the cross-party support so that democracy is not a partisan issue that's dividing left or right, because democracy at the end of the day is something that, it's about all of us. It's about collective self-government. And this isn't something that you can decide on a left-right spectrum. It's just, how do we make these decisions, which is what we're talking about here.
Claudia, we've had a lot of shows on deliberative democracy. You've done a huge amount of work. You're also one of the pioneers of deliberative democracy. How would you define it? Is it essentially just citizen assemblies, or is it more to it than that?
Well, there's more to it than that, even though I think that what we've seen in the past couple of decades is that the main form in which it has taken has been through citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes that have a few defining criteria. So in all of these citizens' assemblies, what sets them apart from other democratic processes and initiatives is that at their heart, there's a relatively small but broadly representative group of people who have been brought together through a civic lottery. So that means literally people receiving randomly invitations to be part of this, to get over that usual barrier to participation of it being what are often called the usual suspects, which is a horrible term, but which refers to the types of people who tend to over proportionately participate in any form of democratic process. So you have a civic lottery to bring together a small group of people, and then you create the conditions for them to be able to grapple with complexity. So it means that they have a lot of time, they hear from experts, they hear from stakeholders, they deliberate together in a facilitated context, and their explicit aim is to find common ground on recommendations that they want to put forward on a specific policy issue. So these defining features all come together, and we've seen them in hundreds of citizens' assemblies around the world.
I know you were just at the Athens Forum, the New York Times event on democracy, but 2 or 3 years ago, we traveled back to Athens to film for the movie How to Fix Democracy. And even back then, we suggested that deliberative democracy, this citizen democracy based on the lottery, was something that was adapted from antiquity, from the Greek version of democracy. Is that true? What did we learn, or what should we learn from the Greek model in terms of adapting deliberative democracy?
Yes, definitely. So myself and many other people working in this field, like David Van Raybroek and Helen Lanmore and others, are definitely inspired by the model of what the technical term being sortition, but we often call random selection or refer to civic lotteries, was something that was at the heart of what were the ancient Athenian democratic institutions. So actually being there in Athens a few weeks ago, I thought that the Athenians could make much more of talking about this history, which is very exciting, and which, if you go there, there's a lot of mentions of Athenian democracy without actually precising what that is. Whereas Athenian democracy at the time were these two institutions, one where people were randomly selected to be part of it, but at the time, obviously, this was only men, not slaves. So we're not talking about things in the same way today, adapted to a modern context. And then the other assembly where it was open to everyone. And again, the same notion of only men, etc., but open to anyone to participate. And these were the two institutions of what we think of as Athenian ancient democracy. And we could be inspired by both of those, I think, today. And within the deliberative democracy field, we talk a lot about random selection, because it, like I was saying at the very beginning, there's all of these inherent design flaws in an electoral democracy that tend towards short-termism, that put re-election over the public good, that put political party logic over the common good as well, where debate is more important than deliberation, where competition matters more than cooperation. These are all things that have been designed into what our democratic institutions are like today. Whereas if we hark back to ancient Athenian democracy and we draw inspiration from random selection, we can see that it can be adapted to the modern context in a way where, we can have a democracy that is actually more, democratic in its inclusivity, in the diversity of who's actually involved in decision making, and in also creating those conditions for people to be able to grapple with complexity and to find consensus and common ground on what are often controversial issues where we see politicians are refusing to act because of that.
Claudia, do you think if deliberative democracy became the dominant form of democracy in our system, we would have the crisis of 19th and 20th century political parties, the parties of the left and the right, conservatives, socialists, liberal parties, who were based, I guess, in terms of the political system on the short-termism that you want to get beyond? Is there a place for traditional political parties of the left and the right in a deliberative democratic system?
Well, the short answer to that is actually no. And in the sense that if you think about how a deliberative democracy functions, it means that everybody comes into it. So anybody who's selected to be part of a deliberative body has been chosen by lot. So they're not there to represent either a political party or an interest group or a civil society organization or the company they work for or anything else. They are there as a citizen representative, there to put themselves also in the shoes of other people in the community and to work together as citizens to come up with proposals on which they find common ground. And so if you think about that, I don't see where the place for political parties actually is. And if we think about the design flaws of the current system, the logic of political party politics trumping the common good in many situations and the refusal to find compromise with political opponents is also something that is, I think, deeply problematic. And I think one of the things that people are disillusioned with when they think about the problem with democracy today.
Now, Claudia, though, you're the one who perhaps sounds a little bit like Rousseau in terms of this ideal of the general will. Are you suggesting then that a deliberative democratic system gets beyond ideology? We can get rid of ideology. Is there something slightly utopian about that, or utopian in a technocratic sense?
Well, I don't know. I take some offense at being called a technocrat because I really well, don't see myself it wasn't that meant way, offensively. But you I know.
And in all seriousness, you work at the OECD, which is a classic manifestation of institutional technocracy, for better or worse. I mean, some people love it, some people don't, and it's often being critiqued by populists like Donald Trump as an organization that doesn't reflect what people want, a certain kind of elite. So this issue of technocracy is interesting and important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I really think so. And you're very right to point out, I work at the OECD, which is in many ways a technocratic institution, but I don't see the solution to our democratic problems as more technocracy. As I was saying earlier, I think actually the move towards more and more technocracy has been part of the problem of the democratic crisis, part of the fuel for populists, and again, in a legitimate way. I was reading recently Michael Sandel's new book about the tyranny of merit, where he talks very much about this increasing move to having people not just with degrees, but with economics degrees being in charge of huge swaths of policy making and decision making, and a lot of decisions which used to have a lot more public debate being pushed just over to experts. And I think that's deeply problematic for numerous reasons, also because we have a huge amount of evidence and research, including Helen Landmore's, which you mentioned earlier, which shows that collective intelligence comes from having a greater diversity of people involved in a decision. So that move towards more and more homogeneity in who's at the decision-making table, I think is problematic for both the democratic reasons, but also in terms of we're not actually getting the best possible solutions to the problems we're facing collectively as a society either. I found it quite striking, the example that Sandel talks about in the book about who was involved in crafting the New Deal. And I think it's something, well, I didn't know before this, and I think many people maybe don't know either, about how it was actually a huge diversity of people. And I would say that most of them probably didn't even have a degree, let alone an economics degree. But there was like the small town banker and all sorts of other people who I think it would be really hard to imagine being involved with what's being talked about now as the Green New Deal or otherwise. There's been such a move to delegating those sorts of decisions to experts that we've come to undervalue the expertise that actually comes from people's everyday lived experiences of interacting with these social and economic issues.
Let's talk a little bit more about deliberative democracy. When we made the movie, I went to Dublin and I spent a very pleasant evening with a woman who had been part of the deliberative democratic experiment. She'd won or maybe lost the lottery, so she committed a lot of her time to participating on the abortion issue, and it clearly was very meaningful for her. And she had some wonderful stories, and actually, I think of all the people I've spoken to, she made the best case for deliberative democracy. The way it mellowed people, made them more open-minded, enabled conversation. And she also spoke, I think, in a very compelling way about the way in which experts can be used in a deliberative democratic system to inform the lottery winners about these complicated systems. But what I'm curious about are the people who don't win the lottery. What about the 97, 98, 99% of people who aren't part of any deliberative democratic experiment? Do you think this kind of system could alienate people because they're even more distant from politics than ever?
It's a very good question. And before I jump into that, I also just want to say, because of all of the discussion about technocrats and experts and so on, that of course experts do play a very key role in deliberative democracy. So I'm not by any means saying it should be just over to the people and that's it. But the expression that gets often used, which I very much like, is that experts need to be on tap, but not on top. So it's up to the citizens to hear from the experts, to deliberate, and then to come out with their own recommendations. But to get to the question about what about the other people who are 99% of the population who are not part of these processes, there's a couple of things here. One, I think, is that there's a general mindset, which again, I think differs when we think about this whole question about direct democracy with referendums versus more deliberative democracy, where you have the random selection and deliberation and then a rotation of people who are involved. And to me, there's a different mindset that goes along with the two of these, where with the deliberative democracy, I mean, I personally think that people cannot, nor even should they, be involved in every decision that is made all of the time. It's just not possible. We also have our work and our friends and families and all sorts of other things going on in our lives. So the idea of us being able to vote on everything all the time, to me, is not only concerning, but just seems actually impossible to do that in a way where everybody could be informed on the issue. So it's rather about creating a system where everyday people are able to, on a rotating basis, play a very meaningful role, tapping into their civic duty for numerous months to be part of a deliberative process, and knowing that on other issues, there are other people like them who are also playing that role. So the way that I see scale, because that's also one of those things that comes up in a lot of these discussions, well, could we scale this to have a deliberation with 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people or whatever, and do it online? And I think that to me goes to the complete opposite way of how I view scaling, in the sense that scaling is about creating the opportunity on multiple issues all the time at all levels of government, so that more and more people can be part of these small processes, because you need the small size for the high quality deliberation, but that there's just lots of these opportunities so that at least once in their lives, everybody could be part of one of these processes. That to me is the idea.
Isn't Audrey Tang, though, in Taiwan trying to scale this? And there's, I'd love to actually do an interview with Audrey for our series. But there's been a lot of very positive response to the Taiwanese model.
Yeah, and I'm not as much of an expert on it, but from what I understand, there's first of all a mix of the online and the in-person, because on its own, there's quite a limit to what can be done with any of these online deliberation tools, and especially when they're only text-based. So I think what's been interesting to see in Taiwan is actually the mix of first having an online element, but then having people actually come in person to deliberate. Again, I have the same questions about to what extent you can actually scale that, because I mean, first of all, a deliberation really truly takes time. From what I've seen in Taiwan, this has been done on like much faster, shorter time scales. But also, you can only do it with so many people in a room where you feel like you can reach consensus as a group. Otherwise, you resort very quickly into aggregating individual people's views via voting, which is quite different in nature in many different ways. So I'm not necessarily saying you don't need what they're doing in Taiwan. I just think it's a little bit of a different model. And I think it's also a different context where you also have the vast majority of the population there, which is online, and which also grew up at a time where the internet revolution happened at the same time as Taiwan becoming a democracy. So there's a different cultural element in Taiwan, which I think is really hard to find anywhere else in the world, really.
Claudia, we've spoken about this fissure, this dichotomy between referendum style reform of democracy and deliberative democracy. In some of the reading I've done, there's been some suggestions that older people are more attracted to the referendum model, and perhaps more conservative people, whereas younger people are more attracted to deliberative democracy. Are you, in your research, in your work, are you seeing this demographic division? Are young people particularly, because young people are very angry, particularly about the environment and the world that's being left to them by my generation. Are young people particularly keen on deliberative democracy experiments in your experience, in your research?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't actually done any direct research on this specifically, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that directly. But I think it's an interesting observation. I mean, my hypothesis, if that is being borne out in the research, would be that, as you're saying, that young people are frustrated with the current system as it is. In a way, actually, referendums have been part of the existing democratic infrastructure in many places for a long time. So I don't think that that's actually seen to many people as something that's new, or that could really help overcome divisions. Because I think one of the things that we are seeing with the democratic crisis is that because of polarization and an inability to have institutions which allow for finding common ground, we are left with inaction on a lot of really pressing issues. So like climate crisis, for example. So I could understand and I could see why young people are perhaps more drawn to it for that reason. But I'm speaking on this purely from almost a more personal perspective. I haven't done any research on that specific question.
Finally, you're a very international person, born in Canada, studied in the UK. I think now you live in Paris. You're part of a very international organization, the OECD, perhaps the most international network. In my conversation with David Van Raybroek, he noted, he was actually talking to me from Bard College in upstate New York, but he's of course based in Belgium. He noted that America and Europe have really diverged on this, that the Americans don't get deliberative democracy. There's very little innovation here. Whereas in Europe, particularly in Northwestern Europe, Belgium, of course, Holland, Ireland, there's a lot of innovation. Are you seeing the same thing? Do Americans, North Americans, and perhaps there's a difference between Canadians and people from the United States here, do North Americans don't get the idea of deliberative democracy?
It's an interesting observation. And I mean, of course, I've been living in Europe now for all my adult life. So it's hard to, even though I grew up in Canada, it's hard to make that direct comparison. But from the research that I've done, what we do see is that there has been less innovation in some ways in the United States. I think also just because of the sheer size of the country and the unique institutional setup of it as well. But there has been some interesting stuff going on, especially at the state levels and more local levels in the United States as well. So for instance, in Oregon, it's been the pioneer of what's called the Citizens Initiative Review, which pairs actually deliberative democracy to the system of having regular ballots there. But turning perhaps over to my country of Canada, there's actually been quite a lot going on, and a lot of the deliberative democracy experiments, even in Europe, were inspired by some of the early ones that happened in British Columbia and in Ontario in the early 2000s, where there were deliberative processes about electoral reform that took place. Now, in some ways, those were seen as failures because they were followed by referendums, which didn't reach the necessary thresholds, which in British Columbia was a supermajority of 60%, and it was only 58% who voted in favor of change proposed by the citizens in the Citizens Assembly. But nonetheless, this, I think, was a big inspiration for a lot of people in Europe and elsewhere. And in Canada, there certainly has been an ongoing tradition of using citizens' assemblies and citizens reference panels at a more local level, notably the organization Mass LVP, which is based in Toronto. I think they've done close to 40 of them. And at the moment, even there's a national citizens assembly happening about democratic expression in Canada too. So I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a huge divide actually between North America and Europe. I just think that they've been moving in different ways and perhaps inspiring each other in different instances, because I know, for instance, in Brussels, the legislation that was tabled to combine deliberative and direct democracy was inspired by what's happening in Oregon. So it's a little more complex than that. I think there's more interaction and more deliberation actually happening between people in the field internationally than ever before.
It's always more complex, Claudia, isn't it? That's your message. That's the point
Indeed.
of deliberative democracy. And I think that's its compelling argument, that the world is complex and politics has become too oversimplified, too divisive, and deliberative democracy can maintain the infrastructure of democracy, but recognize and respect complexity. Is that a fair summation of its attraction, its importance today?
I think that's a perfect way to summarize it.
Well, Claudia, thank you so much for doing such a good job making sense of deliberative democracy. If people want to learn more, because it's a very compelling subject and a lot of people are still not that familiar with it, where would you suggest they begin? What books, what websites, what resources should they start with?
Well, I mean, I'm talking from the with my OECD hat on, so I think
of course, there's nothing wrong with that. You are an OECD person.
Catching the Deliberative Wave report. So, I mean, I think the easiest way is if you type into your search engine OECD Catching the Deliberative Wave. But beyond that, I really do recommend Helen Landmore's new book, Open Democracy, which is incredibly inspiring and I think opens the way for thinking about actually how could we imagine a democracy without elections. David Van Raybroek's book Against Elections, I think actually was an inspiration for me in my earlier days doing this research as well. And then the UN Democracy Fund also published, together with the New Democracy Foundation, a handbook on democracy beyond elections, which came out in 2019. Also a very valuable resource for people wanting to actually do this. There's a lot of those questions about, okay, how do we do a citizens assembly that are answered in there? So those would be my top go-to resources.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on the work you're doing. It's really important and innovative. And I think this is going to be really, in political terms, the big story of the 2020s. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I appreciate you having the space to have all of these conversations.